On the surface, Crestwood Estates looked like a dream community. Rows of freshly painted houses gleamed under the afternoon sun, each driveway lined with perfectly trimmed hedges. The air carried the faint scent of jasmine and freshly cut grass, and the narrow, winding streets were so spotless that even fallen leaves seemed out of place. To anyone driving through, it appeared like a postcard version of the American suburban ideal, safe, organized, and peaceful. But like every postcard, the back of it told a different story. The residents had long whispered about the HOA, the homeowners association that controlled every aspect of Crestwood life. It began small, harmless, even. A few rules to keep the lawns tidy, trash bins stored out of sight, and holiday lights taken down by January. But over time, those rules multiplied like weeds. What once felt like gentle order began turning into suffocating control. The HOA board, once made of friendly neighbors, had evolved into something else, something colder, something that fed on authority. At the center of it stood Margaret Ellison, the HOA president. She was the kind of woman who spoke softly but carried an invisible hammer. Her belief was simple: control equals beauty. Under her watch, the HOA's rulebook expanded from a few pages to a dense, 42-page manual that governed everything from mailbox color to the type of flowers permitted in gardens. At first, residents complied. After all, the neighborhood's property values were soaring, and Margaret's rules seemed to keep things elegant. But as months passed, the atmosphere changed. The HOA started issuing fines for trivial things: a slightly cracked driveway, a wreath hung a week too long, even for kids' bicycles left momentarily on lawns. People complained quietly, but few dared to confront Margaret directly. The few who did found themselves facing surprise inspections, unexplained penalties, and long, bureaucratic delays on even the simplest approvals. The HOA had turned from guardian to oppressor, and most residents simply endured, afraid to rock the boat. That was until one incident broke the silent obedience. It began with a man named Tom Barlow, a retired firefighter who had lived in Crestwood Estates for 10 years. Tom was known for his well-kept yard and his quiet, friendly nature. He rarely caused trouble, until the HOA sent him a $500 fine for having a flagpole that was 2 inches taller than the community standard. Tom appealed the fine, arguing that the rule had changed after his flagpole was installed. The board ignored his request. Then came another fine, this time for non-compliance. By the third notice, Tom decided to fight back. His decision sparked something across the neighborhood. Other residents, fed up with random penalties, began comparing notes. To their shock, they discovered that many of the HOA's recent rules had been passed without a proper community vote. Margaret had allegedly forged signatures to push her policies through. What began as whispers in driveways turned into secret backyard meetings after dark. Families gathered quietly, discussing how far the HOA had gone and how much further it might go if left unchecked. The tension reached a boiling point during the annual community event, the Crestwood Summer Gala. It was meant to be a celebration, a day of food trucks, music, and neighborly cheer. But instead, it became the spark that lit the war. That morning, residents arrived at the park to find that several booths had been shut down. Margaret had personally ordered them closed, claiming they didn't have proper permits. One of them belonged to Tom Barlow's wife, who had baked cookies for charity. When she confronted Margaret, witnesses said the exchange was quiet but heated. By afternoon, news of the confrontation spread across the neighborhood like wildfire. The HOA president had humiliated one of the community's most respected families, and that was the final straw. By nightfall, a small group of residents formed an unofficial committee. They called themselves the Crestwood Coalition. Their mission: to investigate, expose, and dismantle the corrupt practices within the HOA. What began as frustration was transforming into organized resistance. Margaret, however, was no fool. She sensed the shift, the cold glances, the whispered conversations, the sudden drop in attendance at her board meetings. She knew rebellion was brewing, and she wasn't about to lose control of her perfect little kingdom. In the following days, letters began appearing in mailboxes. They weren't fines this time, they were warnings. The HOA accused several homeowners of community disruption and defamation against board leadership. Each letter was signed by Margaret herself. It was clear she intended to crush the uprising before it began. But something had already changed in Crestwood. Fear was giving way to anger. The people who once bowed to HOA authority were now united in quiet defiance. They began documenting everything, every fine, every notice, every suspicious action. Files and folders piled up in living rooms as neighbors shared evidence late into the night. The community was now divided into two sides, those loyal to Margaret and those who wanted her gone. Lines were being drawn, alliances formed. The streets still looked perfect, the lawns trimmed, the houses neat, but the peace had shattered. Behind every drawn curtain, plans were being made. Crestwood Estates was no longer a quiet suburb. It was a battlefield waiting for its first strike. And Margaret Ellison was about to find out what happens when the people she controlled decided to fight back. The night after the summer gala felt different in Crestwood Estates. The streets were quiet, but not peaceful. Porch lights flickered on across the neighborhood as residents gathered in small, cautious clusters, whispers filling the air like a low hum. What had once been an ordinary suburban community was now bracing for confrontation. At the center of it all was Tom Barlow. Though he hadn't planned to become a leader, people naturally turned to him. His years as a firefighter had given him a calm presence in crisis, and now, Crestwood needed that steadiness more than ever. The coalition began as a small group, just 6 homeowners who dared to meet in Tom's garage. But within a week, word spread quietly from house to house. By the time their third meeting came, nearly 30 people attended, all carrying documents, fines, and grievances against the HOA. The stories they shared were astonishing. One woman had been fined for leaving her recycling bin visible for 6 minutes after pickup. Another had been charged $250 for planting flowers that did not match the approved neighborhood palette. Others complained about mysterious maintenance fees that appeared without explanation. The coalition began compiling everything, creating a timeline of every questionable decision Margaret and her board had made. They quickly realized this wasn't about small infractions. It was about control and money. The HOA had been funneling funds into beautification projects that never seemed to happen. Thousands of dollars were missing, and yet, Margaret's private driveway had been repaved twice that year. Still, exposing her wouldn't be easy. The HOA's bylaws were dense and confusing, written in a way that made challenging the board almost impossible. Margaret had built a fortress of bureaucracy around herself. She had loyal board members, neighbors she rewarded with leniency and favors, who voted exactly as she directed. Anyone who dared question her found themselves suddenly under HOA scrutiny. But the coalition wasn't planning a direct attack. They were patient. They began documenting, photographing, recording, collecting. They learned how the HOA operated, when meetings were scheduled, and which board members seemed uneasy about the corruption. A few even whispered that Margaret had gone too far, but fear kept them loyal. Meanwhile, Margaret was tightening her grip. She called an emergency board meeting, where she proposed new community security measures, including cameras at the entrance of every cul-de-sac and mandatory HOA ID badges for contractors. She justified it as a safety upgrade, but everyone knew it was surveillance. The motion passed with minimal resistance. The following week, residents began noticing cars driving slowly through the streets at night, private security hired by the HOA. Their presence wasn't comforting, it was intimidating. Every movement, every visitor, every porch light flicker was watched. The HOA office even sent out an email warning residents that spreading false claims about the board would result in legal action. Margaret's rule was no longer about order. It was about fear. But what she didn't know was that her actions were backfiring. The tighter she squeezed, the more the community resisted. Tom and the coalition decided they needed proof, real, undeniable evidence that Margaret was abusing her position. So they turned their attention to the HOA's financial records. Accessing them legally would require a written request, which Margaret was likely to deny. But one of the coalition members, Lisa Harmon, had once served on the board before Margaret's rise to power. She still remembered the access codes and knew where the digital backups might be stored. One evening, under the pretense of dropping off documents, Lisa visited the HOA office after hours. It was located in a small, leased suite near the community gate, a sterile place lined with file cabinets and security cameras. She stayed calm, pretending to review old forms, and quietly copied several financial ledgers onto a USB drive. What she found later that night made her blood run cold. Tens of thousands of dollars marked as community projects were transferred to an account under the name Crestwood Vision Fund, which didn't exist in the HOA's charter. That account, when traced, led to a personal bank line connected to Margaret herself. The coalition had their evidence, but revealing it was dangerous. If they went public too soon, Margaret would claim it was fabricated and use HOA lawyers to bury them in legal threats. They needed a strategy, something that would expose her corruption and protect the residents from retaliation. They decided to wait until the next quarterly HOA meeting, the one every resident was invited to attend. Normally, these meetings were dull affairs that only drew a few bored attendees. But this time, the coalition planned to fill the room. They would confront Margaret in front of the entire community, forcing her to answer for her actions. As the date drew near, the atmosphere in Crestwood grew heavier. Neighbors whispered behind hedges, glancing nervously toward the HOA office. The once friendly smiles at morning walks were replaced by cautious nods. Margaret, sensing unrest, sent out another HOA notice. It warned residents that outside influences were trying to destabilize the community and that false information was being circulated. She painted herself as the defender of Crestwood's integrity, the savior keeping chaos at bay. Some believed her. Many didn't. The day before the meeting, Tom stood in his backyard, watching the sun dip behind the rooftops. The air was still, but his gut told him this peace wouldn't last much longer. The coalition was ready, but he knew Margaret wouldn't go down without a fight. The next day would decide the future of Crestwood Estates. The war between the HOA and its residents was no longer just brewing, it was about to begin. The morning of the quarterly HOA meeting arrived with a quiet tension that settled over Crestwood Estates like fog. The streets looked the same, lawns perfectly trimmed, mailboxes neatly aligned, not a trash bin out of place, but beneath that polished order, the residents were preparing for battle. By late afternoon, small clusters of neighbors gathered outside the community center, their faces tight with anticipation. Normally, HOA meetings drew barely a dozen attendees, but today more than 50 people arrived. Some came out of curiosity, others out of anger, and a few simply because they could sense something big was about to happen. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and the hum of whispers. Rows of folding chairs faced the front of the room where a long table stood draped in white linen, the throne of the HOA board. At its center sat Margaret Ellison, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. She was dressed immaculately, every strand of her silver hair in place, a binder in front of her that seemed more like a weapon than a record book. When the meeting began, she followed the same familiar routine, reading minutes from the previous quarter, approving budgets, and discussing maintenance schedules. Her voice was calm and controlled, as if nothing unusual was happening. But the crowd wasn't listening to her pleasantries. They were waiting for the coalition. Then, when Margaret opened the floor for resident concerns, Tom Barlow rose from his seat. His presence commanded quiet. He didn't shout, didn't wave his arms. He simply stepped forward with the composure of a man who had faced far worse than a boardroom confrontation. In his hands, he carried a thick folder, the coalition's collected evidence. He began by summarizing the frustration of the residents, the endless fines, the unexplained fees, the arbitrary rules. Heads nodded across the room. People who had stayed silent for years finally saw their own grievances spoken aloud. Then, Tom moved to the financial records. Calmly, methodically, he explained what the coalition had found: the missing funds, the suspicious account, the transactions tied to Margaret's personal line. A murmur spread through the room like electricity. Margaret's smile faltered for the first time. She interrupted with a sharp tone, declaring the accusations false and defamatory, claiming the coalition had illegally obtained private records. But Tom didn't stop. He had prepared for this. He explained that under HOA law, Financial transparency was the right of every homeowner. He showed the copied ledgers, each marked with Margaret's digital signature. The room erupted. Residents began talking over each other, demanding answers. Margaret tried to regain control, banging a gavel, threatening to clear the room if order wasn't restored. But it was too late. The illusion of her control had cracked. Several board members looked shaken. One, a middle-aged man named Harold, refused to meet her eyes. The others whispered nervously, unsure of how to proceed. Margaret realized the power balance was slipping. Her calm facade turned brittle as she accused Tom of leading a rebellion against the HOA's authority. But the word rebellion only fueled the residents' anger. For years, they had feared her. Tonight, they didn't. As tension reached its peak, Lisa Harmon stepped forward. She spoke clearly, reminding everyone that the HOA existed to serve the community, not the other way around. She produced printed statements showing the mismatched transactions, copies of permits that never existed, and even screenshots of Margaret's emails authorizing the transfers. The board went silent. Margaret stood up slowly, her voice trembling but defiant. She announced that the meeting was over, declaring that the matter would be handled privately by HOA legal counsel. But the residents refused to leave. Someone from the back shouted that a vote of confidence should be held immediately. Another demanded an independent audit. The murmurs grew into a chant, "Audit! Audit! Audit!" Margaret froze. She had never lost control of a meeting before. Tom, maintaining his composure, suggested the board step aside temporarily while an independent investigation was conducted. He wasn't shouting, but his calmness carried more power than any raised voice. Margaret glared at him, not with fear, but with cold hatred. Before leaving the room, she turned to the board and issued a quiet command, "Adjourn this chaos." Then she walked out, heels striking the tile floor like hammer blows. The room buzzed with nervous energy. The residents had finally stood up and won, at least for the moment. But as Tom looked toward the doorway Margaret had exited, a pit formed in his stomach. She wasn't the type to retreat in defeat. She was regrouping. Over the next few days, Crestwood was alive with gossip. Neighbors who had never spoken before were suddenly united by a shared sense of hope. Social media groups filled with posts about taking back the neighborhood. For the first time in years, people felt the HOA might actually be held accountable. But that feeling didn't last. 2 days after the meeting, HOA security began making rounds again, more frequent this time. Residents received emails from the board's legal department warning that false information and slanderous claims were being investigated. A few coalition members received letters threatening lawsuits for defamation. Even Tom's mailbox was filled with anonymous notes, some supportive, others venomous. Margaret was fighting back from the shadows. She called a closed-door emergency board session, replacing 2 members who had shown signs of disloyalty. Those who remained loyal were rewarded with promises of protection and future consideration. She was building a wall around herself, preparing for the counterattack. The coalition had won a battle, but not the war. They knew Margaret's power didn't come from truth. It came from fear, structure, and paperwork. She still controlled the HOA's legal framework, and she would use it to crush anyone who stood against her. The next move would decide everything. As Tom sat at his kitchen table late one night, reviewing the mounting evidence, he realized they needed to go beyond confrontation. It wasn't enough to expose Margaret's corruption. They had to remove her entirely, legally, and permanently. But to do that, they would need the signatures of at least 2/3 of the homeowners in Crestwood Estates, people who still feared what might happen if they signed their names against her. It was a near impossible task, but it was their only way forward. The war for Crestwood had truly begun. The days following the explosive HOA meeting marked the beginning of Crestwood's quiet revolution. What had once been a neighborhood of manicured perfection now simmered with unrest. Every mailbox, every lawn, every porch light seemed to carry a secret, a symbol of which side its owner stood on. The coalition's goal was clear: remove Margaret Ellison as HOA president and hold a community-wide re-election. Legally, it required signatures from 2/3 of the homeowners, a near impossible threshold. But impossible was no longer a word that frightened them. They began their campaign in secret. Tom, Lisa, and a few trusted residents divided the neighborhood into zones, visiting homes late in the evening when the sun had set and security patrols were light. They carried clipboards, legal forms, and conviction in their hearts. Each signature they collected wasn't just ink on paper. It was defiance, a stand against years of fear. Some residents opened their doors eagerly, signing without hesitation. Others hesitated, glancing nervously toward the street as if the HOA could appear out of thin air. A few refused entirely, whispering that Margaret had friends in high places and that fighting her would end badly. But night after night, the list grew longer. Still, Margaret wasn't blind to the movement. She noticed the sudden gatherings, the unusual traffic of residents visiting one another, the quiet energy that pulsed through Crestwood like a heartbeat she couldn't control. She knew they were plotting, and she would not allow it to succeed. Her counterattack began subtly. New violation notices appeared on the doors of known coalition members. Trash bins out of regulation placement. Driveways needing immediate repair. A sudden rule update banned door-to-door solicitation, punishable by fines up to $1,000, a direct strike against the signature campaign. The coalition met again, this time in Lisa's basement. The mood was tense. The new rules made their mission riskier, but stopping wasn't an option. Lisa suggested moving their operations online. Encrypted messages, private forums, hidden group chats. It wasn't just a fight for their neighborhood anymore. It was about the principle that power should serve the people, not control them. While most of the coalition operated in secrecy, Tom began reaching out to disillusioned board members. Harold, the man who had looked uneasy during the meeting, was the first to crack. He confessed that Margaret had threatened to ruin his reputation if he ever voted against her. He agreed to leak internal communications proving she had manipulated board decisions and forged approval records. It was the breakthrough they needed, hard evidence of corruption that couldn't be explained away. But before they could act, Margaret made her boldest move yet. One morning, every resident received a thick envelope in their mailbox. Inside was a community reform proposal, supposedly designed to restore harmony and protect neighborhood unity. Hidden deep within the fine print was a clause that extended her presidency by another 2 years and gave the board the power to expel any homeowner found acting against HOA interests. It was a declaration of war. The coalition realized they were running out of time. If that proposal passed, their rebellion would die before it ever fully began. They needed to reach the 2/3 mark before the vote. Tom and Lisa decided to go public. Using the evidence they had gathered, they created a neighborhood-wide email and an anonymous website exposing Margaret's corruption. Screenshots, financial records, and board meeting documents appeared online within hours. The community erupted. The once quiet residents now had proof of everything they had suspected for years. Margaret's office phone rang nonstop that day. Some residents demanded explanations, others resigned from her committees. She issued a public statement calling the website a fabrication created by a small group of disgruntled homeowners. But the damage was already done. As outrage spread, so did fear. Margaret's loyalists, a small but vocal group, began defending her fiercely, accusing the coalition of sabotaging property values and bringing chaos into paradise. Neighborhood social feeds turned into battlegrounds of accusation and defense. The once peaceful Crestwood Estates was divided straight down the middle. That evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Tom walked street to street, gathering the final signatures. The sound of cicadas filled the air, mingled with the distant hum of security cars circling the blocks. Every door he knocked on could be a friend or an informant. When he reached the last house on Maple Court, he paused. Inside lived an elderly couple who had lived there since Crestwood was built. They were quiet, private, and had always sided with Margaret, out of loyalty, not malice. Tom explained what the coalition was fighting for, not rebellion, not chaos, but fairness and freedom. The husband listened silently, then looked toward his wife. Without a word, she nodded and took the pen. Their signatures completed the list. Tom felt the weight of the moment. the culmination of weeks of fear, planning, and quiet defiance. They had done it. By midnight, the coalition had collected the required number of signatures. The petition to remove Margaret Ellison was official and legally binding. They would deliver it the next morning. But as the neighborhood slept, the HOA office lights burned late into the night. Inside, Margaret sat at her desk, a glass of wine in one hand, the community proposal in the other. Her expression was calm, too calm. She knew about the petition. She knew who had signed, who had organized, who had leaked her records. And she had already planned her counterstrike. The war wasn't ending. It was only entering its next phase, one that would turn Crestwood's quiet rebellion into full-scale chaos. The morning the petition was submitted began with sunlight and hope. Tom and Lisa stood outside the HOA office just after dawn, the thick folder of signatures tucked securely in Lisa's hands. For a moment, Crestwood Estates looked peaceful again, sprinklers hissing across perfect lawns, morning joggers nodding politely, mailboxes shining in the new light. But peace in Crestwood had become an illusion. When Lisa placed the petition on the reception desk, the young clerk behind the counter froze. The HOA office was silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights. The petition represented something unprecedented, an uprising wrapped in legal language. Within its pages was the collective voice of the neighborhood, a demand for justice that could strip Margaret Ellison of her throne. Lisa smiled politely and left, but she and Tom both knew the real battle was just beginning. Within hours, the entire board was notified. Margaret received the petition at her desk just before noon. She read every line slowly, her expression tightening with each page. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from rage. 56 signatures. Enough to trigger a recall vote. Enough to end her presidency. By afternoon, she had already begun her counterattack. An emergency board meeting was called that same evening, closed to the public. The official notice claimed it was to review procedural irregularities in the petition process. But everyone in the coalition knew what that meant. Margaret was searching for a way to invalidate it. Inside that meeting, Margaret's tone was sharp, deliberate, and icy. She accused the coalition of fraud, claiming that several signatures were forged and that unauthorized solicitation violated HOA policy. Her remaining loyalists nodded in agreement, their fear disguised as support. The vote to pause verification pending investigation passed instantly. By the next morning, new letters began appearing in mailboxes, notice of pending review. The HOA declared the petition invalid until further examination. Fines were issued to those suspected of illegally soliciting signatures. The coalition's victory had lasted less than 24 hours. But this time, Margaret had overplayed her hand. Residents who hadn't been part of the coalition began questioning why their signatures, their own legal rights, were being disregarded. A growing number of people saw the pattern for what it was, a desperate attempt to hold power. Tom refused to retreat. He and Lisa contacted a property rights attorney who specialized in HOA misconduct. The lawyer, a calm but formidable woman named Evelyn Carter, agreed to represent the coalition pro bono, seeing their cause as a precedent-setting case. She immediately drafted a cease and desist letter ordering the HOA to stop interfering with the recall process. When Margaret received the letter, witnesses said she laughed, a brittle, cold sound that echoed down the HOA office hallway. She wasn't intimidated by paperwork, she was paperwork. She responded with her own legal threats, accusing Evelyn of harassment and defamation. That week, Crestwood became a war zone fought through emails, letters, and legal jargon. Residents woke up to new regulations almost daily. Trash pickup rules changed. Parking spaces were reassigned. Even the playground was suddenly closed for safety maintenance. Every change was a message, I still control you. But something in Crestwood had shifted permanently. People stopped being afraid. They began talking openly in front yards, meeting in broad daylight, waving to each other not as strangers but as allies. One Saturday afternoon, the coalition hosted what they called the People's Meeting. It wasn't in any official venue, just Tom's backyard, under a canopy of oak trees. Nearly 100 residents showed up, bringing food, lawn chairs, and copies of HOA letters they had received. Evelyn stood before them, explaining their rights in clear, confident words. She described how the HOA had violated its own bylaws and how the recall vote could still be enforced through county court. She reminded them that the HOA existed because of homeowners, not the other way around. Her words struck deep. The community left that meeting not defeated but empowered. For the first time in years, Crestwood felt united not by fear of the HOA, but by defiance against it. But Margaret wasn't idle. Late that night, she met privately with her most loyal board member, a man named Cliff Danner, who handled the HOA's security contracts. They spoke behind closed doors for nearly 2 hours. The next morning, security patrols doubled. Residents noticed new cameras installed near intersections and streetlights. The HOA claimed it was for community safety. Then, the real retaliation began. The HOA website published a long statement accusing unnamed individuals of tampering with community records, spreading false financial data, and endangering the neighborhood's reputation. The coalition wasn't named, but everyone knew who the message targeted. Tom's mailbox was vandalized. Lisa's home received anonymous letters telling her to leave before it gets worse. Even Evelyn received threatening phone calls at her office. Fear began creeping back into Crestwood, subtle but heavy. Some residents who had once signed the petition started to distance themselves, afraid of retaliation. Others whispered that Margaret had friends on the city council, that she could make life miserable for anyone who crossed her. Still, Tom didn't back down. He knew every authoritarian relied on one weapon, fear, and that the only way to win was to strip that weapon away. He and Evelyn filed a formal motion with the county clerk to schedule the recall election independently of the HOA. It was a legal loophole rarely used but valid under the state's property law. If the motion passed, the HOA would be forced to hold a fair vote within 30 days. Margaret was furious when she learned of it. That night, she sat alone in her office, staring at the framed photo of Crestwood's founding ceremony. Her reflection glimmered faintly in the glass. She told herself she was the reason this neighborhood looked perfect, that without her, it would fall apart. The fines, the rules, the control, it was all necessary. It wasn't corruption, it was order. At least, that's what she told herself as she poured another glass of wine. Outside, the neighborhood lights glowed softly under a clear sky. But beneath that peaceful scene, the machinery of rebellion and retribution kept grinding. The recall motion would be decided within a week. And both sides knew, whatever the outcome, Crestwood Estates would never be the same again. The week leading up to the recall vote was unlike anything Crestwood Estates had ever seen. What was once a quiet, meticulously ordered neighborhood now pulsed with tension. Neighbors who once waved to each other now crossed the street without making eye contact. Smiles had been replaced by suspicion, small talk by silence. The county's decision to enforce an independent vote sent shockwaves through the community. For the first time in Crestwood's history, the HOA's authority had been challenged and legally undermined. Margaret had tried to block it, filing an emergency injunction through the HOA's lawyers, but the court denied her request. The vote would proceed, and the results would be binding. The coalition's petition had turned into a movement. Yard signs began appearing overnight. Restore Crestwood integrity, vote yes for change. Others pushed back with countersigns. Keep our HOA strong, support order. The streets became silent lines of ideology, every manicured lawn a declaration of loyalty. Margaret watched it all from her window. To her, the signs weren't symbols of democracy, they were acts of betrayal. She had built this community from perfection, she thought, and now they wanted to tear it apart. Her anger hardened into resolve. She wouldn't let them win. The HOA office turned into a war room. Margaret and Cliff organized volunteers to educate residents about the dangers of removing experienced leadership. Flyers appeared on every doorstep warning that property values would plummet if the board was replaced. Emails circulated about outside agitators, veiled references to Tom and Lisa, claiming they wanted to defund the HOA entirely. Meanwhile, the coalition mobilized. Evelyn guided them like a strategist, ensuring every step was legal and documented. They went door to door, calmly explaining the evidence, the missing funds, the false fines, the manipulation. They didn't promise chaos. They promised fairness. By the night before the vote, Crestwood felt like a battlefield before dawn, quiet, but with an energy you could almost hear. The vote was held on a Saturday, in the community recreation hall. Normally used for yoga classes and birthday parties, it now looked like a courtroom. Folding tables lined the front, each with stacks of ballots and volunteer monitors. One from the HOA, one from the coalition, and one appointed by the county to ensure neutrality. Residents arrived in steady waves. Some came as couples, others alone. Many avoided looking at Margaret, who stood near the entrance in her signature navy blazer, smiling tightly as she greeted voters one by one. Her charm was brittle, her eyes sharp, scanning for disloyalty. Tom stood across the room, greeting people with quiet warmth. He didn't campaign that day, he simply listened. He understood that this wasn't about speeches anymore. It was about trust, something Margaret had lost long ago. The ballots were simple. Should the current HOA president, Margaret Ellison, be removed from office? By noon, nearly every homeowner had voted. The hall was tense with murmurs and the rustle of papers. The final ballot box was sealed at 2 p.m. under the watchful eyes of both sides. The county representative began the count immediately, assisted by 2 neutral volunteers. Outside, residents waited in the park across from the hall. The air was thick and still. Children played quietly, sensing their parents' unease. Every few minutes, someone glanced toward the hall doors, expecting them to burst open with news. When the counting finished 2 hours later, the representative stepped outside holding a single envelope. Margaret stood near the steps, her face pale but composed. Tom and Lisa waited nearby, surrounded by coalition members who barely breathed. The representative read the results aloud. Out of 84 eligible homeowners, 78 had voted. 46 voted yes. 32 voted no. Margaret Ellison was officially removed as HOA president. The crowd erupted, not with cheers, but with gasps of disbelief. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, applause began to ripple through the park. People hugged. Some wept. Others simply stood there, stunned that it was finally over. Margaret didn't speak. She turned, walked briskly to her car, and drove away without a word. Her navy blazer shimmered briefly in the afternoon light before disappearing down Crestwood Drive. The board appointed an interim president from the coalition's ranks, a quiet, level-headed woman named Karen Liu. Her first act was to suspend all ongoing fines and order a full audit of HOA finances. The crowd applauded again, though this time it was quieter, relief mixed with exhaustion. For the first time in years, Crestwood felt free. But beneath that victory, not everything was peaceful. Margaret's loyalists were furious. They whispered that the vote had been rigged, that Tom and Evelyn had brought politics into their perfect neighborhood. Small acts of sabotage followed, graffiti on fences, anonymous complaints, a brick thrown through the window of the community office one night. The coalition tried to calm things, reminding everyone that change took time. But they couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret wasn't finished. 1 week later, Evelyn received a notice at her law office. Margaret Ellison had filed a defamation lawsuit against the coalition, the interim HOA board, and several individual homeowners, demanding damages for character assassination and emotional distress. It was a final strike from a dethroned ruler, one last attempt to reclaim control through fear and litigation. Tom read the letter that evening as he sat on his porch. The neighborhood was quiet again, eerily so. The lawns looked perfect, the mailboxes gleamed, and the soft chirp of crickets filled the air. Yet, despite the victory, he couldn't shake the sense that something darker was still coming. Because people like Margaret didn't just disappear. They waited. And they came back. For a few brief weeks, Crestwood Estates felt alive again. The streets buzzed with cautious optimism. Residents waved at each other. Children played freely in yards once shadowed by HOA patrol cars. The oppressive air of control that had hung over the neighborhood began to fade. The coalition, now serving as the interim HOA board, worked tirelessly to restore transparency. They canceled unnecessary fines, reopened the community garden Margaret had shut down, and began reviewing the HOA's financial records. But beneath the surface, cracks remained. The audit revealed something astonishing: nearly $240,000 in HOA funds were missing. The ledger showed years of maintenance expenses paid to a shell company called Me Consulting LLC. The initials were obvious. Margaret Ellison had not only ruled the neighborhood with an iron hand, she had quietly bled it dry. Evelyn presented the findings to the board in a late-night meeting. The evidence was overwhelming: fraudulent invoices, forged signatures, and personal transfers linked to Margaret's bank account. Yet they faced a dilemma. Going public would ignite another storm, and Margaret's lawsuit was still active. They decided to move carefully, consulting the county prosecutor before making any announcement. Meanwhile, the neighborhood's tone shifted again. Margaret's supporters grew increasingly defiant. They formed small gatherings at night, whispering about taking back Crestwood. Flyers appeared on doors calling the new board illegitimate. Someone even placed fake violation notices on random mailboxes, mimicking the old HOA's tone to spread fear. It felt like the ghost of Margaret still haunted every street. Tom noticed it first: a black sedan parked across from his home, always in the evenings, engine idling. When he approached it one night, the car sped off. Another resident reported receiving anonymous emails warning her to watch what she says about Margaret. The board installed new security cameras near the recreation hall, but the paranoia only grew stronger. Margaret herself had vanished from public sight. No one saw her at the grocery store, the post office, or anywhere nearby. Her house sat dark, its blinds drawn, the lawn uncut, an eerie contrast to the perfectly trimmed yards around it. Then, one morning, Karen Lou arrived at the HOA office to find the door ajar. Inside, papers were scattered across the floor. The filing cabinets had been pried open, and several folders were missing, including the financial audit report. Whoever broke in knew exactly what to take. The police were called, but the investigation moved slowly. There were no fingerprints, no security footage, and no witnesses. Only a lingering scent of Margaret's old perfume, a faint trace of lilac and musk that made everyone uneasy. The next day, every member of the coalition received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photocopy of a single page, a legal notice titled Notice of Foreclosure Proceedings. It bore their home addresses and a forged HOA letterhead declaring they were in violation of community insolvency policies. It was psychological warfare. Evelyn immediately called an emergency meeting. Her voice, usually steady, trembled with anger. "This isn't a lawsuit anymore," she said. "This is intimidation." The board agreed to file a police report for harassment, but deep down they knew Margaret was playing a longer game. Then came the news report. A local TV station ran a story on HOA corruption in Crestwood Estates, featuring clips of angry residents and blurred financial documents leaked to the press. The report framed Margaret as a misunderstood leader targeted by vindictive homeowners. The source of the leak was anonymous, but the slant was unmistakable. The neighborhood erupted again. Some residents, confused and frightened, began questioning the new board. Had they gone too far? Was Margaret actually innocent? Lies spread faster than the truth, and within days, the fragile peace collapsed. Tom found his car keyed with the word traitor. Lisa's garden was vandalized. Evelyn received a letter at her office, a death threat disguised as a poem, signed only "The Real Crestwood." It was clear the war hadn't ended. It had only gone underground. Late one night, as rain poured over the quiet streets, Tom sat on his porch watching the storm roll in. The reflection of lightning danced on the wet pavement. He thought about everything that had happened: the fines, the protests, the vote, the lawsuit. And he realized something chilling. Margaret didn't need to be president to control Crestwood. She had already built the perfect system, one so deep in fear and routine that it could run without her. Even from the shadows, she could pull its strings. And somewhere, behind those dark windows in her silent house, She was watching it all unfold. The next morning, police cars lined Crestwood Drive. A body had been found near the retention pond, a man in his 50s, a longtime resident and former HOA volunteer. Cause of death, unknown, but suspicious. The neighborhood froze. Fear returned like a tide. Evelyn stood at the edge of the police tape, staring into the murky water. For the first time since the recall, she felt truly afraid. Not for herself, but for what Crestwood was becoming. Because when power leaves a vacuum, something darker always rushes in to fill it. And in Crestwood Estates, the shadow of Margaret Ellison was only getting stronger. By the time autumn arrived, Crestwood Estates no longer looked like the picture-perfect community it once was. The grass was still trimmed, the mailboxes still aligned in military precision, and the fences still painted the same approved shades of white. But the soul of the neighborhood had withered. You could feel it in the silence. Neighbors no longer trusted each other. The cheerful weekend barbecues had vanished, replaced by locked doors and curt waves. Residents whispered about the man found by the pond, though no one dared to mention Margaret's name aloud. The police investigation remained open but inconclusive. Evelyn worked around the clock to keep the HOA from collapsing entirely. The lawsuit Margaret had filed was draining their resources, tens of thousands in legal fees, endless paperwork, sleepless nights. Every court hearing felt like a reminder that Margaret's reach extended far beyond her title. Then came the subpoena. During a pretrial motion, Evelyn received an official request for all HOA financial documents dating back 5 years. Attached was a signature from Margaret's attorney, and, to her horror, a letter from the county clerk confirming that some of those same documents had already been submitted anonymously weeks prior. Someone had broken into the HOA office not to destroy evidence, but to plant it elsewhere. When Evelyn finally reviewed what the county had on file, she was stunned. The records had been altered, forged to make it appear that Evelyn, not Margaret, had signed off on the false invoices and personal transfers. The implication was devastating. Margaret wasn't just fighting back, she was rewriting history. That night, Evelyn sat alone in the HOA office, staring at the mountain of documents. Outside, thunder rumbled across the hills. She realized what Margaret was doing, not just fighting for power, but destroying the very structure of truth itself. Across town, Tom received an unexpected visitor. It was one of Margaret's old allies, Cliff Anderson, the former treasurer. His eyes were sunken, his voice trembling. He handed Tom a small flash drive. "You didn't get this from me," he muttered before hurrying back to his car. When Tom opened the files, his heart pounded. There were scanned receipts, bank statements, even emails, proof of Margaret's embezzlement scheme, with Cliff's digital signature on every transaction. It was the missing link. Evelyn took the evidence straight to the county prosecutor. This time, the proof was airtight. Within 48 hours, a warrant was issued for Margaret Ellison's arrest on charges of fraud, obstruction of justice, and witness intimidation. But when the police arrived at her home, Margaret was gone. Her car was still in the driveway. Her phone, purse, and keys were on the kitchen counter. The back door was open, curtains fluttering in the wind. The only thing left behind was a single envelope taped to the refrigerator. Inside was a short note, written in her elegant cursive. "Crestwood was perfect until you ruined it. Now it's yours. Let's see how long it survives without me." The message wasn't a confession. It was a curse. Weeks passed. The lawsuit was dropped, the HOA audit completed, and the county seized Margaret's property to cover restitution. But the damage was done. Many residents moved away, unable to bear the tension that still lingered in every corner. Homes sat for sale, their pristine facades masking years of conflict. Evelyn and Tom stayed, determined to rebuild. They restructured the HOA, reduced the power of the board, and replaced fear with community. Slowly, the neighborhood began to breathe again. New families moved in, unaware of the storm that had once consumed the place. For a while, life returned to normal, or something close to it. Then, one spring morning, Karen Lou received an envelope in her mailbox. No return address, no stamp. Inside was a photograph. It showed a group of Crestwood residents standing in front of the community sign, smiling during a charity event the week before. In the background, just barely visible among the trees, was a woman, standing still, watching, wearing a navy blazer. Karen stared at the photo for a long time. She didn't show it to anyone, not even Evelyn. She placed it in a drawer, locked it, and never spoke of it again. Over time, the story of Margaret Ellison became legend among the newer residents. They spoke of her name like a ghost story, the woman who tried to control everything and vanished when her empire fell. Some swore they saw her walking the streets at night. Others said they heard her voice echo through the community speakers, long disconnected. The truth was simpler and far more haunting. Crestwood Estates had been built on fear, power, and silence. And even though Margaret was gone, those things never truly left. Years later, a new HOA president would rise, promising order, unity, and discipline. The first sign of change was small but familiar: new regulations about fence colors and mailbox heights. Then came the fines. Then came the silence. And so, Crestwood began its slow descent back into the same quiet tyranny it thought it had escaped. Because in neighborhoods like these, power never dies. It just changes hands.